So, chapter 6 is significant. Most people would not say this. They would say chapter 7 is really the pivot to the book. But I think that by the time we finish tonight at midnight, you will agree, that this chapter, it's not just the substance, it's the structure and the position of it. So, starting there, let's just remind ourselves, it's been 2 weeks, so if I repeat myself, you just kind of have to bear with me. Um, Chapter 2 through 6 are a modular unit, right? You have chapter 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 that form the portion of Daniel's book, which is primarily historical narrative. Yes, there are dreams, there's the statue. Yes, there is I saw the tree and then I turned into an animal in chapter 4. But if you think about it, chapter 2 and chapter 4, the dreams by Nebuchadnezzar, they all occur in the context of narrative, a story, right? Nebuchadnezzar has the dream of the statue. He calls in the wise man. We learn about the vision through the story that unfolds around its interpretation. So, same for 3, same for 5, same tonight for 6. So, chapter 6's significance in one way is just it marks the end of the narrative portion of the book. Now, don't mishear me. I am not saying that chapters 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 do not have any narrative. There are sentences here and there where the story advances, but the focus really becomes Daniel's dreams and Daniel's visions. And those dreams and visions take place in the chronology that we've built in chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So I would state it differently this way. We met Daniel in chapter 1. Today, at the end of chapter 6, he is arisen to the second in command of the now Persian Empire. That's really the end of Daniel's life, functionally, right? That's the two bookends: his birth in Jerusalem, his death in Persia. Everything that he dreams, all of the visions in 7 through 12, fit in the time frame we will have already experienced, which is a little deceiving, right? Because on the one hand, we'd say that makes it easy to read the visionary portions. But it's scripture's way of focusing on what Daniel saw, not on Daniel's life. It's on the giver of the dream, not the dreamer himself. So we're ending the narrative portion as we go through today. Now, remember where we left off last week. This was chapter 5, 2 weeks ago. This is chapter 5, verses 30 and 31. So recall, this is the handwriting on the wall. And you had Belshazzar, who is the king of Babylon, the grandson of the Nebuchadnezzar that we met in chapter 2 in the early pages. He is killed. Who is he killed by? The invading Persian army under Cyrus on the night between October 11th and October 12th, 539. So on that time, chapter 5, verse 31, we have a fundamental change, not in the book, but in human history, right? And specifically, that change is what I've tried to reflect on this graph that we're revisiting from week 1. So if you think about the span of history that we cover from Daniel 1 to chapter 6, we began with Assyria dominant, but Assyria collapses very quickly. And why does it collapse? Because Babylon rises. When we come to Daniel chapter 6 or chapter 5, it's the red dot on the right. You have Babylon's collapse and Persia's rise. And if we were to project this chart out, we would ultimately have Persia like a parabola collapsing and Greece rising. And if we projected it out again, we would have Greece's collapse and Rome's rise. So you can see how really, if we play this graph out, what you have is Daniel's vision of the statue with the 4 substances: gold, silver, bronze, and then the iron mixed with the clay. Underneath, I've identified what Daniel would have been called during each of these empires. He was Daniel, that's his Jewish name, Belteshazzar in the Babylonian court. And although it's not used because this portion of the book is written in Aramaic, not Persian, if you translate Daniel into Persian, it would have been transliterated Daniel, which is wonderfully close to Danielle, but that's a different conversation. So I want you to kind of place ourselves where we are going into chapter 6, because One of the biggest mistakes we can make in reading chapter 6 is assuming that the state of the world and the state of the royal court and the state of Daniel's standing is the same as it has always been. Everything fundamentally changed on October 12th, 539, when Persia came in and Babylon ended. I've been trying for 2 weeks to think of something that's happened in my lifetime that would be similar to kind of the earth-shaking change. And the closest I can come to is the collapse of the USSR, because it felt like one day you go to sleep and you've got the evil Soviet Empire, and the next day you just have chaos with the Russian Republic or the Federation. And it was like night and day. The only other thing I could think of was there was a life before 10 a.m. on 9/11, and there was a life after. And everything changed, not just in terms of what it meant to be an American, but what it meant to be a citizen of the world from September 11th to September 12th. And I think it's that kind of event. So to some extent, we have to recalibrate before we enter chapter 6. So here would be a map of the Persian Empire at its peak under Cyrus the Great. Now, the Persian Empire runs, all told, about 200 years. So it lasts much longer than Babylon. It lasts a little bit less than Greece, and it does not really even hold a candle to Rome. But it does last quite a bit. You can see it stretches on the far west from the Mediterranean basin over where Turkey is to the far right. You're really getting over to the north of India and Pakistan. Massive world empire centered in the Persian median middle ground, with the capital largely located and remaining at Babylon. So the world itself, like geographically, we don't see a change. But the way the world is run shifts. Because before 539, this map was split. You had the Babylonian Empire over on the west, and then you had the Medes and the Persians up here, kind of in this portion. And as you move out of Nebuchadnezzar's reign into his descendants, is when you started to see that push that we saw 2 weeks ago that ended with them sneaking into the gates of Babylon. So now you're in a united empire that is, for all intents and purposes, the largest empire the world had seen up till that point. And that fact colors everything about how we interpret chapter 6, the size and unwieldiness of the Persian Empire. So let's go back here just to kind of remember structurally. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, the historical narratives are built as a chiasm. So the structure is designed to help us follow it, which is why from the beginning in chapter 2 to chapter 7 next week, you have these visions. In 3 and 6, so where we are today, you have mere stories about God acting to supernaturally preserve his people. In chapter 3, it was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In chapter 6, it's going to be Daniel. What is the focus? It is always the middle. And the middle is how God deals with pride. So you'll remember that in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar, fresh off the heels of having this dream of the statue, decides naturally to build one. And in building it, he takes on a great sense of pride. He then has all of these encounters in chapter 3. And in chapter 4, he's humbled for his pride. Remember, he's basically he comes to think of himself as a wild animal, not a ruler of humanity. But that moment humbles him, and he comes to what I believe was genuine saving repentance at the end of chapter 4. That's contrasted with Belshazzar, the final Babylonian king, who, recall, there was not an ounce of pride in his body. Even after Daniel interpreted the writing on the wall, there was no repentance, there was no remorse, there was no reluctance to continue partying and celebrating and declaring himself a god. Instead, he sat on his throne, drunk on his own pride, until Cyrus's army marched into that throne room. So you have what God does to pride in both chapters 4 and 5, but the human reaction that differs with the two. So now I want to augment this a little bit, because chapter 6 is really requires having more historical breadth. which is why I'm not a fan of taking the Lion's Den story and just plopping it out as like a lesson or a sermon, because you miss the richness of the story if we divorce it from the preceding chapters. What we know is that in chapter 2, Daniel would have been between 14 and 18 years old, because remember, he was very young when he was taken into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar on his way back to his coronation at the fall of the Assyrian Empire. In chapter 3, Daniel would have been between 20 and 25 years old. This would be when he'd already ascended to serve as the prime minister of the Babylonian Empire. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were also young, but at this point in his life, Daniel's in his early 20s at most. In chapter 4, when he interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream, this is a flash forward in time. Likely 20, 25 years have passed. So now we have middle-aged Daniel. When we jump to chapter 5, we have another time jump. Daniel is now an old man, 70, 80 years old, which means when we come to chapter 6, Daniel is, by most accounts, in his mid to late 80s. He reminds me in a way of the Apostle John on the island of Patmos, who we have an image of John as the young firebrand disciple following Jesus. But by the time we get to 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John and the revelation of John, we have an older, more seasoned, more experienced apostle. So too with Daniel. Bear in mind, almost every picture you and I have seen of Daniel in the lion's den gets Daniel's age wrong. The flannel graphs I grew up with made him look like Ethan. He looked like David, right? Fighting Goliath, very young. And bear in mind as we go through the story, that is just not so. Daniel is advanced in age, which definitively colors how we view this. So last on preparation, and you have this in your notebook or in your notes, like the preceding chapters, Daniel structures this chapter in a chiasm. So at the beginning and the end, you have Daniel being shown favor. At the beginning, it's Darius, who we'll call Cyrus, because I think it's a title shift. We'll talk about that in a minute. And at the end, Darius blesses him because he's a fan of his. In between there, you have Darius or Cyrus signing a royal decree. In verses 4 through 9, it's the decree that anyone who prays to anybody else or through anybody else will be thrown into the lion's den. In a royal decree is a king's command that has the force of law. In America, we'd call them executive orders, right? So Darius makes a royal pronouncement passed into law, both at the beginning and at the end, but they have different import. As you move further in, we have really what you see throughout Daniel's life, which is he's going to be accused. There are always people pointing at him. And you have their accusation at the front, and then you have Daniel's vindication or their punishment at the end. As you move in a layer, you have Darius as the focus. So you're going to see that Darius, although he has to throw Daniel in the lion's den, he's not happy about it. Daniel goes in the lion's den, and when Daniel is not eaten by the lions, Darius actually celebrates that. So you've got Darius's response as the bookend there. Moving in one more layer, you have Darius saying, go to the lion's den, and you have Darius or Daniel saying what happened in the lion's den, which is important for this reason. Once again, I think Daniel does a little bit of what's that game in New York where the 3-card Monte, right? Where you kind of quickly move the cards and you shuffle them to try and disguise it. Daniel does a little bit of that. We think that chapter 6 is about the experience in the lion's den, but structurally it's not. Structurally, the focus is Darius asking Daniel, was your God able to save you? Did the God that you worship come through? Because that's really what the chapter is about. Daniel's experience in the lion's den is fantastic, but let's face it, Daniel was already a believer. The focus is the effect of the lion's den incident on Darius and by extension, the Persian Empire, and by extension, the world. So we have to shift our focus just a little bit. What I've decided to kind of call this one is consistent faithfulness. And I'm not going to hide the ball. Normally I'd build to it, but here's my thesis on chapter 6. I think understanding chapter 6 comes down to understanding that it happened at the end of Daniel's life. And that the reason chapter 6 happens from start to finish is because Daniel was unimpeachable in his character for 80 to 90 years of his life. There was never a moment of reproach. There was never an ethical shortcoming. There was never a moment where he was less than fair or equitable or truthful. And because of a lifetime that he had built this reputation before two world rulers, two major empires, the events of chapter 6 unfold the way they do. So understanding Daniel's legacy is why I think it's the end of the narrative section. I think this is the Bible's way, the Holy Spirit's way of saying, we started with Daniel going into exile. We're ending with Daniel sitting in the prime minister's chair. But for all the changes, Babylon, Persia, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, this, that, the other, what never changed was Daniel's integrity and faithfulness. And I can't think of a more important theme to bear in mind, whether it's in this group or frankly for any Christian, is the importance of consistent faithfulness. So that's how we're going to frame this. The first section of the text reminds us that we're always evaluated for our character. Daniel was, Jesus was, Paul was, we are. And so we start in verse 1. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom the satraps should give an account so that the king might suffer no loss. Now, let me just revisit this so that we're all on the same page. You have Darius the Mede at the end of chapter 5. That's the Darius here. The question is Darius the Mede the same person as Cyrus the Great? And that matters because remember, Cyrus the Great was prophesied to be a king of Persia who would take the throne, rule the world, and free the Jews that were in exile, including Daniel's friends, right? So it is relevant to ask ourselves that question. We talked more about this 2 weeks ago. Go on YouTube if you forget. It was late. But my view, and I think most of the scholarship supports this view, is that Darius is the Median name for Cyrus the Persian, right? This is a very poor analogy, so forgive me. But if Tom yells my name in the middle of Main Street on Sunday morning, he yells Austin. If Eliana yells my name, she yells Dad. If a client yelled my name, they would yell counselor or any untold things on Main Street. My name, I am the same person, but the context of by whom I am being addressed dictates the name. So here, I think that's kind of what we have going on. Is Darius the Mede, is Cyrus the Persian. It just depends on whether you are a Median saying it or a Persian. So for our purposes, I'm going to refer to him as both because I think he was the same person. But please understand, if you read enough commentaries, you will find some people saying Darius is a separate person who ruled separately from Cyrus as kind of an underling. I just don't think the text supports it for reasons we'll see today. If you buy my view, which I hope you do, then when it says Darius, it says Cyrus. And we are now in the first year of a consolidated Persian empire. Here is why that matters. This is not like a president coming into office after a brutal campaign in the summer and in the fall, where they had a couple of months to put together a transition team, and they've been thinking about governing for a long time, and they've got their cabinet lined up, and everything's ready to go. This was a change of world power. And so when Persia takes Babylon out and dominates their empire, there is a natural period of adjustment to a larger empire. You see the same thing in modern European history, kind of when the Spanish and the French all start racing towards the New World and they discover the Aztecs and Mexico and all those things. It throws Europe into chaos for like a century. Darius, Cyrus, very, very clever. And Persia was very well organized. So it really only takes him about a year to figure all this out. But understand number two. What is number one? That Daniel is old. Number two, this is a period of imperial instability. Yes, Persia's in charge. And yes, Darius or Cyrus is the head of the Persian Empire, but he's still stabilizing his new kingdom. And some of what happens in this chapter is because of that. So you're in the first year of what Persia's rule would look like. Now, bear in mind, events in history don't happen one at a time. It's kind of like life that way, right? Things always come in bunches, good, bad, or somewhere in between. How many times in life have you or I gotten the luxury of responding to one problem at a time? Never, never. History is the same way. So at some point, either before verse 1, at the same time as verse 1, or after verse 1, Darius, Cyrus, is doing something else incredibly significant that you don't see unless you flip to Ezra chapter 1. In Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, the Bible says that in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, which I think you could just say in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, / Darius of the Medes, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all of his kingdom and also put it in writing. You say, why does that matter? Read the proclamation. Thus says Cyrus the Persian in the first year of his reign, the same time as Daniel chapter 6, verse 1, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you, the people of Persia, of all of his people, you are Jews that belong to God. May his God be with him. Let him, you Jews, go to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And let every survivor, we could say it this way, let everyone who has survived 70 years of exile, is what he's saying, in whatever place he lives or sojourns, be assisted by the men of this place, Persia, with silver and gold, goods and beasts, besides freewill offerings for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. All of that is to say this. At the same historical time period that the events of chapter 6 are unfolding, either right before, which is John MacArthur's view. John MacArthur says the events of Ezra chapter 1, what events? The return of the exiles. That first wave with Ezra happened before Daniel's experience in the lion's den. White says it was after. It could have been at the exact same time. I will leave to your good judgment what you think it is. I tend to think it happened right after. I think Daniel in the lion's den, Daniel chapter 6, happened early that year. And I think that the events of Daniel chapter 6 are in part why Cyrus is now saying that God has given me the kingdom. I think that seeing Daniel spared in the lion's den drove the stake home for Cyrus. And it is part of how God ordained and sovereignly oriented history to use Cyrus to send his people home, as prophesied 150 years earlier by Jeremiah. But understand, this is the backdrop for Daniel. Daniel knows that prophecy. The Jews know that prophecy. In fact, I would go so far as to speculate the following. The people who are in Darius's or Cyrus's court know that prophecy. So what they know, we should know, because it colors why people do what they do. So Darius sets up the kingdom. It gives us this whole organization. He's going to have 120 satraps. He's going to spread them through the kingdom. There are going to be 3 officials. Daniel's one of them. And it says that the point of this is that the king might suffer no loss. Literally translated, that means the king won't suffer injury, right? So we don't really think this way in America because we're a republic. But a totalitarian or a dictatorial state always views the person of the sovereign as equivalent to the safety of the state. So I've been reading a fascinating book that's name is escaping me right now, but I will remember, The Whispers. And it is about Sir Cecil and Francis in Queen Elizabeth's court. and they were her spy masters. And they, I mean, look, these people were brilliant, probably the smartest tandem in English history for my limited knowledge. But for them, when they were defending Elizabeth from, Catholics set on putting Mary, Queen of Scots, back on the throne, what they were really in their minds doing was defending the country. There was no separation, right? The country is the king is the country. And so the king suffering no loss or no injury means the idea is this structure is supposed to keep the kingdom safe. So let's look at the structure for just a moment. At the top, we have Darius or Cyrus. Okay, at the top, he is the man in charge. Scripture in verse 1 tells us that underneath him, he had commissioners. These are the different translations you might see. It says high officials. Some translations, I think New King James, might say presidents. It does not mean like our president. It just means in charge, or what I like, which is commissioners. Who are the three that hold this office, that are high officials? Daniel and two unknown Persians that apparently Darius Cyrus really liked. So there is your upper level kind of tier. Underneath these high officials, you had protectors of the kingdom. That is what satrap translates into, protector of the kingdom. So it would have looked something like this. You would have had, I did not put 120, right? You would have had a host of these satraps, protectors of the kingdom. Their job is to collect taxes and to enforce the laws of Persia. So they wear a lot of different hats, right? They handle collection. That makes them like sheriffs. They would have been magistrates. They would have enforced the laws. Their job is to keep all of the little fiefdoms running. But if you give people power, what does power absolutely do? It corrupts them. And Darius understands this. And so he recognizes you can't have 120 people running around collecting taxes and enforcing the laws, because if so, one of those 120 is going to think that they're the new Cyrus, and you have a bigger problem on your hands. So what he does is over them, he puts a layer that he trusts. These would be those high officials. But he recognizes you have to have someone you trust more than the rest, someone right underneath you, right? That's Daniel. So he's built these layers in the bureaucracy, but Daniel is going to sit at the top. He is the first among equals, if you want to put it kind of that way. If you wanted to put it in the US cabinet type comparison, I mean, look, it's great being the Secretary of Agriculture. They call you the honorable, you get bodyguards, that's wonderful. But if you gave someone a choice, they would much prefer to be the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense, or war, whatever we're calling it nowadays. Because those, although they are equal on the org chart, we all know who's really more equal than everybody else, right? That's the idea here. So Daniel's been elevated above all of these people in the first year of Cyrus. Now think for a minute about why that's weird, why that's unusual. Daniel is not Persian. Daniel did not grow up in the Persian Empire. Daniel did not serve Cyrus the Great during the campaign to take over the world. In fact, for the second time in his life, Daniel is a captive to a bigger empire. It happened when Nebuchadnezzar took him captive, and now it has happened again. So it takes him less than a year to rise all the way up the ranks, which begs the question that we'll get into later of why that could be, right? The easy answer is, well, because God said, yes, I understand that. But I think it also speaks to the important issue, which is Daniel's character was well known. So that's the structure that we're dealing with. Verse 3, then this Daniel became distinguished above the other high officials and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So first, let's look at Daniel's character, then we'll talk about what it means. It says he had an excellent spirit in him. I like this translation more. Exceptional qualities. Exceptional qualities. It was because of his qualities that Darius or Cyrus made the decision to first put him with the first three. So if we come back here, put him above all the protectors of the kingdom, but equal to the high officials. Now, Darius has observed Daniel, and he decides, I'm going to get rid of this triumvirate in the middle, and I'm just bumping Daniel up the org chart. So that's the promotion Daniel is in line for. He's going to become second in command of the empire with those, high officials underneath him and the satraps way underneath him. Now, that alone explains what happens, right? We could say jealousy is a green-eyed monster, and all of these people did not like that Daniel was going to be promoted, and so they try to torpedo him. And that is true. But there is much more going on here than just, the green-eyed monster that is jealousy. So what is it? It's this. Daniel's exceptional qualities are not an aberration. So let's walk for just a minute through Daniel's life as we have seen it. In verses 3-4 of chapter 1, you had the king commanding his chief eunuch. This was way back in Jerusalem when Daniel was 10 or 14 years old, and telling him, go find me the royal family, the nobility, youths without blemish, good appearance, skillful in wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, competent to stand in the king's place. And the person that they picked was Daniel. So when Daniel was a wee teenager, everyone knew. How can I say everybody knew? Because Nebuchadnezzar's eunuch knew. And Nebuchadnezzar's eunuch had only been in town a couple of days. So his reputation preceded him, that he was wise, good looking, exceptional quality. He was smart. He was a quick learner. He was smooth. He was trustworthy. You fast forward to the end of chapter 1, verses 17 and 20. This was after the whole I'm going to eat vegetables for reasons I'm still not clear on. But hey, I'm going to eat vegetables. God gave them learning and skill and literature and wisdom. Daniel has an understanding in visions of dreams. What do we know about Daniel as a teenager? Now having gone through, remember, his 3-year apprenticeship is about to start. He's in the middle of training, so he's like a high school student. And we're told in every manner of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them. Don't blow past that. The king is inquiring of Daniel. He finds Daniel and his friends 10 times better than experienced statesmen scholars. And the boy is 15, 16, 17, 18. If we flash forward to chapter 2, verse 47-49, now Daniel's graduated out of his 3-year training program, and he's an apprentice Chaldean. Remember, the Chaldeans are the scholars. Right? So he's like a PhD candidate trying to get his degree so he can become a college professor. And he interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the four-substance statue. And the king says, truly, your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. And the king gave him high honors, great gifts, made him ruler, made him chief prefect. And what does Daniel do with this power? Does it all go to his head and he makes himself the unquestioned head of the Babylonian Empire? No. He says, King, remember my 3 buddies? I want you to make them officials in the Babylonian city because they're wise too. And you remember them, don't you? From the incidents that happened in chapter 1, O king. They looked healthier in appearance too. This was Daniel also as a teenager. We flash forward to chapter 4, verses 8-9. This is Daniel, my age, right? 40, 45. Daniel came in before Belshazzar as the writing. And I'm sorry, this is Nebuchadnezzar when he had the dream of the tree, and he doesn't know what it means that he's going to eat, plants like a wild animal. Daniel tells him the dream. And look at the description. Daniel came in before me, said Nebuchadnezzar. He, Daniel, was named Belteshazzar after the name of my God, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. For a polytheistic thinker, this is a high compliment, right, to Daniel. And this is 30 years later. Nothing has changed. Daniel's been sitting on top of the food pyramid, and nothing has changed. Daniel has survived who knows how many attacks on his character, and nothing has changed. Daniel could have everything, and nothing has changed. We flash forward again to chapter 5, verses 11-12. Daniel is now an octogenarian, right? This is the night of October 11th, 529, as the empire is about to collapse. And remember what the queen mother came in and said about Daniel? There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. He had an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding. He could explain riddles. He could solve problems. Why don't you ask him? Daniel never changed. Through all of these events, over all of these decades, Daniel never changed. Wearing all of these hats, student, apprentice, the prime minister of Persia. Keep in mind, by the time we get to the end, he's out of favor, right? He's not the prime minister anymore. That's why they had to call him in. But he's still the same Daniel with the same character. And I think in that sense, it is Daniel that someone like Peter is thinking about in 1 Peter 2:12, when he commands us on this side of the cross to keep our conduct among the Gentiles honorable. That's what Daniel did. He kept his conduct in front of the Babylonians honorable. They didn't always agree with him, but he was a man of honor. So that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of your visitation. That's exactly what happened with Nebuchadnezzar, right? Nebuchadnezzar saw Daniel and his goodness and glorified God. But the trap door in this verse, the part we don't always like, is that right there. When they speak against you as evildoers. Now, I'm convinced what Peter was thinking about was not Daniel. I think that what Peter was thinking about is the Beatitudes that he would have heard from Jesus sitting on the mountain. And I think what Peter was remembering when he wrote these was, blessed are the persecuted. Blessed are you when they persecute you and they hate you for my name's sake, for you'll get the kingdom of God. And I think what Peter is reminding us and thinking through here in real time is the key is, are they speaking against you as an evildoer when your conduct has been honorable? Because in that case, they'll see your response and glorify God. Or do you deserve it? So simple but horrendous analogy, right? If I live like Daniel and I am accused by a client of stealing their money out of my trust fund, they have spoken against me as an evildoer. But if I look at my life and I know that I have kept my conduct honorable, my response is going to glorify God. And I will be vindicated. Maybe not here, maybe not now. Maybe I do go to jail and lose my license. I don't know. But at the end of it all, God's going to say, well done, good and faithful servant. No matter what that Gentile accused me of in stealing their money. Now, let's flip it. I did steal their money. I stole all of it. And I used it to buy a fleet of Cybertrucks that I'm going to just drive around the Metroplex. Right? This is the current debate in the Irabali House, is whether I need a Cybertruck. Now, in that scenario, I have not kept my conduct honorable. So when I am spoken out against and accused, I don't really have a leg to stand on. So I don't really care what I say at that point. Nothing I do is going to glorify God. Nothing. See, Daniel understood this concept, which is why he lived an honorable life, which is why evildoers come against him in verse 4 and 5. Then the high officials and the satraps, so that second layer, those are the other two, and the bottom layer, and sought to find ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. But they could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men, the high officials and the satraps, said, we shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. So we'll get to the theology, but first let's deal with the facts. The fact of verse 4 is that you have these high officials and satraps. They get together and they hatch their little conspiracy, right? So the question is, do all 120 satraps convene some clandestine conclave in the deserts of Persia to conspire against Daniel? And the answer is almost certainly not. So when verse 4 says the high officials and the satraps, I would propose you think of it this way: a very vocal minority. First of all, in the group of 120, some probably like Daniel. I mean, even I have people that like me. So anybody can have friends. Okay. So Daniel probably had a few in the group of 120. Some probably had better things to worry about than Daniel. because they're in charge of a spreading empire with King Cyrus sitting over there ready to start throwing people in lions' dens. So maybe they're worried about collecting taxes and keeping order. Then you have some who maybe don't like Daniel. He's a little precocious, he's a foreigner, but crack on. Do your thing. Just as long as I'm getting rich off the corruption, I don't care. So you have a small group, and most commentaries agree that what you have here is a small group that gathers together, and they are rabble rousers. Okay, they are rabble rousers. Let me give it to you in Baptist terms. These are the people that go to the senior pastor and say the following. Now, I know you don't know this, but a lot of people are talking about the vacation you went on last year. Now, I'm not going to say it's everyone, Pastor. I'm not going to say that, but a lot of people are talking. That's them. They're the ones that kind of gin up all this trouble, and then they go to the boss and they try and cause even more trouble for somebody else. That's what they're doing here. Specifically, they're trying to find ground for complaint against Daniel. They want to find some rope they can pull on to unwind his rise, right? They want to show the emperor has no clothes. So what does the Bible tell us? It says with regard to the kingdom. So they start first in his professional life. They can't find ground for complaint or fault because he was faithful and there was no error or fault. So what does that tell us? They are out of luck because everything they look at, they find the same thing. Daniel is trustworthy. He's not corrupt. He's not dishonest. He's not negligent. Look at that last line, no error or fault. Negligence means you have a responsibility that you do not meet. So the church would be negligent if the church did not clean up spilled banana peels outside of the front entrance and all of us fell and broke our back. We would say the church was negligent. They had a duty, a responsibility to do something, and an error, they made a mistake and did not. They're responsible. They couldn't find any mistake on Daniel's part. He never messed up. He never left work a few minutes early. He never came in a few minutes late. He never used his company credit card to buy a nice lunch. Okay. He never did any of those things that are rampant in any nation or in any business or in any organization. He was completely trustworthy. He was not dishonest. And that to me says the most. That means he was always fair, right? He was prime minister of Babylon, been around a long time. And when Nebuchadnezzar was running around like Bevo in the fields of Persia, history would seem to indicate it was likely Daniel running the kingdom. And still, for all of that, nobody can say Daniel is dishonest. Instead, they say what in verse 5? We cannot find any ground for complaint against Daniel. There is nothing in his professional life that we can manipulate or leverage to destroy him. There's no chink in his armor. There's nothing in his personal life. There's nothing in his relationships. There is nothing with this guy. Now, this reference I just thought of, so forgive me, but it's what if you've seen we're going to use Batman in Sunday school. In the second Christopher Nolan Batman movie, it's the Joker, and he's trying to destroy the city. And the way he does it is he identifies the district attorney, who is Harvey Dent, and he calls him Gotham's White Knight. And the whole movie is a simple premise. If you can destroy the best of us, what hope do the rest of us have? That's what they want to do. They want to destroy Daniel because he's the White Knight. He is the one that has shown impeccable character. The problem is they can't. So they find the only thing they can, the last line, unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. So he's not done anything wrong politically, economically, financially, socially, culturally. This guy has never put a step wrong. The only way we can bring a complaint against this guy is that he's too faithful to his God. He's too true to his convictions. And I will tell you, this verse deeply convicted me over the last 2 weeks. Because I dare say, well, I won't speak for anyone but me, because this is a very harsh statement. There is no way anyone could ever say that about me. It just is not so. For 2 reasons. Number one, if you searched my life far enough, you would find moments I have been dishonest. I mean, you just would. And if that disqualifies me, then you guys can teach. I've been negligent. There are moments I've been a horrible husband and I've been a deficient father. There are times that I have mailed it in on Sunday mornings because I was tired. There have been times I have left work early and gone to work late. So someone wanting to attack me, they don't get to line 2. Line 1, they're good. They could easily dissect my life because there was also an Austin before Christ, right? So let's just say, though, they miss it all. Like my private investigator that I say, go find everything you can about this witness. And he comes back and he says, they're perfectly clean. And I'm like, I don't know about that, but let's just say. Then we get to the second line. Do I really think that the one flaw people could point to my life would be Austin is too faithful? Austin is too much like Jesus. Austin's character evidences too many fruits of the Spirit. That Austin, he spends too much time making his life a living sacrifice. And I don't think I could say that. That could be said about me either. So this verse 5, should convict us as Christians because that's the goal. The goal is that every avenue of life points back to the center. And the center is, if you want to come at me, the only thing that you can do is challenge the consistency of my character as a believer, because that is what they're saying about Daniel. So what do we do with his character? Well, let's break it into 3. Number 1, we can infer from this, Daniel never, ever, ever hid or compromised his conviction. Daniel never bent. Now, let me clarify. We know that Daniel was tactful because in chapter 1, he made that deal about, how about we make a 10-day bet? And I'll eat my veggies and you'll eat your, steak, and we'll see which of us looks better. That was pure cleverness. Daniel was clever the whole time. Remember when Nebuchadnezzar told him the dream about the tree in chapter 4? And Daniel stood there for an unknown period of time, grieving, until Nebuchadnezzar said, I know it's bad. Tell me. And Daniel said, I'll tell you, but your enemies are going to love it. You're going to hate it. That's Daniel being tactful. Daniel was a diplomat. Daniel was a politician. And I don't mean that in a negative way. Daniel dealt with politics and diplomacy and other nations. So Daniel did that with never, ever hiding or compromising who he was and what he believes in 80 to 85 years of life. When I say he didn't bend, I don't mean that he didn't deal with people on people's terms. What I mean is he never said, for the sake of expediency or safety or security or prosperity, I'll let God come second this time. Never. And they knew that, which is why they could say what they did in verse 5. Number 2, Daniel must have been excellent, not just competent. And there is a difference. Competence is just enough. Let me say this differently because I know Dana will make me regret I said it later. Millennials, I was going to say my generation, but I do not count myself among the lost. Millennials get a knock in the workforce, and as many of you know, for being entitled and lazy. They are competent, but very few of them, in my limited experience, are excellent. They don't adopt the first in, last out, not to be busy, but to learn. They're not triple checking their writing. They'll do it, and some of it's good, okay? But where's the excellence? Where is it when you sit there and you say, this was well done? Daniel, everything was well done. I will tell you this, when I wrote this, I was in New York, and it's what I thought about the student ministry. Now, look, I don't dance and I don't sing, but what Andy has done with the student worship ministry of Prestonwood is exceptional. Those kids were like a Broadway show. And here's the thing, their excellence pointed where? To Christ. Daniel's excellence pointed to God. It was not just the bare minimum. Daniel always did it all the way. Number 3, and this one challenged me too. Daniel's life was a cohesive whole. It was not parts. And what I mean by that is this. A lot of people live life this way. It's like, always. They have their personal life. You got to be kidding me. And they have their professional life. Frankly, I do this. So I'm just throwing myself under all sorts of buses tonight, I guess. There's Austin the lawyer, and there's Austin when I'm not. And for a long time, I thought if you keep these two separate, then everyone is better off, because my family never gets cross-examined when Ethan doesn't clean his room. And the love I have, like for you all, doesn't bleed into my professional life, so that I'm not like questioning witnesses harshly. This, though, is not how the Christian life is supposed to be. So some of us construct it like this, a little Venn diagram, where who we are in the middle overlaps, but there's still part of us in the personal space. There's part of us in the professional space, and you could put anything you want here: family, work, church, home. Fill it. You do you on that one, right? You get my point. We kind of give this little overlap section and we say, I'll be the same person in the same way in this limited area. Well, that's better, but I don't think that's what Scripture is either. Scripture says, this is your personal life, this is your professional life, this is your Christian life, and they are all overlapping, and they are all one whole, because you are one whole pursuing Christ wholeheartedly. And this is what Daniel did. Daniel did not separate Prime Minister Daniel from Jewish exile Daniel. He could have. He could have done what Naaman does, which is what we'll do Sunday, where Naaman tells Elisha, see, now you guys don't have to come on Sunday, where Naaman tells Elisha, look, I've got to go back to Syria, and I'm going to have to worship Syria's gods. So could you maybe give me a little papal dispensation so that God doesn't get angry when I do that? Because in my heart, I really do love Yahweh. And Elisha says, okay. But that's not Daniel. Daniel does not separate it. Daniel, wearing his prime minister hat, does not remove Daniel, the believer in Yahweh. They are all one person, which means you can't attack him at the chinks. You can't squeeze in the gaps. That's what made Daniel so formidable to them, because they couldn't unwind it. Now, we live in an age, I would say, you can disagree with me, I think kind of everything post-Watergate really changed this in America. Because up until Watergate, we viewed the presidency and politics this way. Watergate changed it, because then we started to say, well, I guess you can be a bad person, but a good president. You can do great things. Like I mean, look, Kissinger, I think he's brilliant, but you could do what Kissinger said and say, Nixon, bad person, great foreign policy. And it all balances out. For Americans, this is much more comfortable. We don't think this way, but the Bible does. This is why I think it's so hard to be a Christian in this day and age, because we're conditioned to separate life into parts. And you can be one person with your friends, and another with your spouse, and another with your kids, and another with your colleagues. And as long as you keep those parts all separate, it's all good. And what Daniel shows us is it's not, right? We're supposed to be a cohesive whole. That is the character that's revealed in the manner that their attack falls short. They cannot find a way. So instead, the only place to confront Daniel is for his conviction. So if we're evaluated for our character, and our character is what it should be, the opposition cannot be us. It has to be what we believe. This is what makes ad hominem attacks so powerful. An ad hominem attack is when you're arguing with someone about something substantive, right? So Tom and I get in an argument about whether we're going to start Sunday mornings at 7 a.m., given the change of rhythm. Okay. And Tom says people aren't going to get here at 7. And I bring 15 studies that say they will. We're having a substantive conversation. But when I start losing and I call him Four Eyes, the problem for me is I don't know where to hit him. So I just collapse it all into one big attack. That's what they're doing. They attack on conviction. You see that in verse 6 and 7. Then these high officials and satraps, again, remember the vocal minority, came by agreement to the king and said to him. Now, let's stop there. came by agreement to the king and said to him really translates better into they came hastily or tumultuously. That's a great word. I love that word. So it's an image of them. It's an image of them all in a big old group outside of the royal chamber, and it's the Israelites in the wilderness. Grumble, 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 grumble. Complain, 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 complain. Plotting, scheming, just making things up. And they come into the throne room, and it's not an orderly presentation. They are hastily and just firing. I'll give you the simple way of looking at it. Throw everything at the wall and see if it sticks. Right? That's what they're doing. So what do they say? Oh, King Darius, live forever. Long live the king. We've seen this a million times. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors, are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, note in verse 7 what they do. This is the same thing that we saw in chapter 3. In chapter 3, remember Nebuchadnezzar built his massive spire-sized statue? And we'll go back and read because I've since forgotten the sequence. Yeah, verse 2, then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces. And it repeated that over and over and over. That's what they're saying. They're saying, everybody's talking, O king. All of your leadership is worried about something, and we agree the king should establish an ordinance. That just means a royal law, and enforce an injunction. An injunction is just a command to do or not do something. You get an injunction saying you can't go within 500 feet of somebody. You can't do something. That's an injunction. Note what they want the injunction or the law to say. Whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, literally, what they're saying is anyone who requests a request to anyone but the king. So sometimes you'll hear people say they were making Darius a god. They were saying, Darius or Cyrus, you be God for 30 days. And who wouldn't take that offer? I think it's more nuanced than that. It's more what they're saying to him is whenever anybody wants to offer a prayer to one of our many gods, they have to go and pray in the name of Darius. Pray in the name of Cyrus. So in evangelical language, Darius becomes the mediator between God and man. That's what they're saying. They're saying you get to basically be the mediator between the divine and the mortal. Now, that's an awfully tempting deal. And so this is what they're trying to do. So let's look at the conspiracy, look at the plan from two different angles. First, if you look at it from Cyrus's view, like what is it they're trying to accomplish as built around what they understand about him? Well, number one, this is like flattery gets you everywhere, right? If you buy what some people say, they're basically telling Cyrus, let's treat you like a god for a month. It's your special time, king. You're God. What would you like to do? If you take the more nuanced view that I think is right, it's the same thing. Because if I can't go to God, but I have to go through some, what am I talking about? This is easy. They wanted to make him the Pope. That's what they wanted. They wanted to name him the head of their religion. And so anything has to go through our friend, Pope Cyrus I. That's what they're saying. This is pure flattery. Because who wouldn't be flattered by the offer, especially when everybody's talking about how great you'd be as this mediator God? Number two, they deceive Cyrus. How do they deceive him? Well, look back at what they say in verse 7. All the high officials of the kingdom are agreed. That flat out untrue. They allow him to believe that every single person has had a conversation, had a meeting, and we're all behind this, king. Why don't you get with the program? After all, we're trying to make you a god. So you've got flattery, you've got deception, and then you've got intimidation. Underlying all of what they say is King, everybody's talking, and we all want you to do this. And the implication is, and if you don't, dot, dot, dot. All of the prefects and all of your satraps and all of your high officials and all of your counselors and all of your magistrates and all of your sheriffs, everybody's going to be really unhappy. And what year are we in of his new imperial reign? 1. That's why it matters so much that the kingdom is somewhat unstable, because Cyrus is no man's fool. And if he loses his ruling class, he could lose the throne. So do you see the tactics they use to prime the pump against Daniel? Flattery, deception, and intimidation. That makes the world go round, right? Now, what about us to Daniel? Well, if you look at the conspiracy from Daniel's point of view, they understood, they knew that the whole plan is built around the concept that Daniel's not going to stop praying to God, right? That's the whole thing. That's verse 5. So they had to understand that about him. But they also had to understand, number 2, that Daniel would not add to God. It wasn't just that Daniel worshiped God. It was that Daniel worshiped only God. So they had a pretty good bead on Daniel. I mean, they've been watching him for 80 years. They should. They understood that he would neither disavow Yahweh, nor would he allow Yahweh to share his glory with anybody else. So they actually have much better theology than many Christians I know in America. They understood what true faith was. Worship one God and one God only. Put it in New Testament language, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and whoever shall come to the Father shall come through me. Right? They understood that that's what Daniel's view was. That's what this is all about. Verse 8 and 9. Now, O king, they say, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document and the injunction. Now, I always try and tell you when I'm tilting into Austin interpretation and out of what I think is grounded. This first part, now, in my mind, I think this is a not so veiled threat. I don't think they're saying, as a result of everything we've just told you, you should strongly consider it. I think that Cyrus kind of has the gun to his head. And they're saying, don't think about it. Don't talk about it. Sign it. Because if not, all of your satraps, your prefects, your counselors, your magistrates, and your high officials that are all involved here are going to have a few things to say about your refusal. So I think there is very much tangible pressure on him right now. Now, I'm not giving Cyrus a pass. He chooses to do it. That was weak. That's fine. But we can understand where Daniel never compromised or bent. That's exactly what Cyrus does here. So then they say, sign it. And why does that end the discussion? Because according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, it cannot be changed or revoked. Now, this, we'll talk more about this in a minute, but that notion comes from this concept. So this is called Cyrus's cylinder. It's dated by carbon dating to the same time we're in, 539, 538 BC. And it's from this cylinder that we have extra biblical confirmation that under Persian law, once the king issued this category of law and signed his name, that's it. You can't change it. You can't revoke it. You can't nullify it. Now, this is strange to us because laws change all the time. Now, I'm not advocating you all know my view on this, but just kind of think through the pro-life, pro-choice issue over the last 100 years. It wasn't allowed. Then Roe says it kind of is allowed. Then Griswold is decided by the Supreme Court, and they say it's not kind of allowed, it's absolutely allowed. Get an abortion whenever you feel like it. Then Dobbs turns it on its head. Our laws change all the time. In fact, if you watch the news, they sometimes change many times in the same day. But with the Medes and the Persians, it was not that way. This was a special kind of law that once it was signed by Cyrus, that was it. It was over. It could not be changed. And there were 3 reasons why. Number 1, kings rule by divine right. So kings are strong, they don't change their minds at a whim. That's not strength, right? This is how we think of what traditional political science calls strongman rule, which is the theory that if you're ruling on the basis of your authority, you cannot change your mind. Now, as Christians, we know the inverse is true. One of the strongest traits of a good leader is what? Being able to say, I know I said that, but I was wrong. But the world, they don't view it that way, especially with kings. So the reason you wouldn't change rules or laws is because it would make the king look weak. It would make him look mercurial. And they had enough mercurialness with their gods that changed their minds every other day. Number two, it was also practical. There is no internet, there is no telegram, there is no TV or radio. So if the king on Monday says this is the law, and then on Tuesday he modifies it, and on Wednesday he goes back to the original, and on Thursday he goes back to Tuesday, and on Friday he says, I guess I just had a bad dream, never mind, forget it, that law is off. You'd have mass chaos. So it's partially just the politics of the empire. Number three, as a result, the Persian system was more focused on process than fairness. It was more focused on the procedures and the system than it was on getting the right result. This should not be a foreign concept to most of you, because I guarantee you almost everyone in this room has at some point watched the news or watched a Netflix special or something and said, I can't believe they have that gun that the criminal used to kill his wife, and the judge won't let the jury hear about it. Why could that be? And you talk to someone like me and I say the following and you all roll your eyes. Due process. Criminals have rights, the system, and everybody goes, whatever. He did it. You don't believe me? O.J. Simpson. The system protects the process over the result. And if I could just be fair for a second, the reason that the Persian system did that and the reason the justice system tries to do that is point number two and point number one. If you start having things change on a situation by situation basis, you never know where the goalpost is. If the referees at the Super Bowl say, yeah, look, I mean, I know that a yard's a yard and you need 10 of them for a first down. But I mean, look, it's New England. It's been a long time since Tom Brady. We're just going to call a yard a foot for them. You know, we really like that Drake May kid. He's a good Christian. Right? Go ahead. Right? We can't do that. Can't start changing the rules. So this is why the law of the Medes and the Persians is ironclad. Once you sign it, it is what it is. This is not unfamiliar to us as Bible students. You've seen it before. Specifically, in 473 BC, I don't know, about 60 or 70 years later, another Persian emperor, Xerxes this time, will do the same thing. In Esther chapter 1, his advisors come to him and say, issue a royal order from you and let it be written among the law of the Persians and the Medes so that it may not be repealed, that the queen, Vashti, Esther's predecessor, shall not be allowed to come before the king. And she is kicked out as queen and probably off with her head. Then at the end of Esther, remember, they expose the plot in that dramatic dinner with the queen and Xerxes. And then Haman, the evil Haman, is exposed and he's hung on his own gallows. Really, he's impaled. And does Xerxes end with everyone lives happily ever after by saying, get rid of that law that on this day all the Jews in my empire will be killed? He says, I can't. But I could pass another law that if you kill them first, it's okay. Because the law was sacrosanct. You could not change it. So, all of that then said, we've looked at the conspiracy. Let's kind of just distill it. Number one, what was Daniel's weakness? God. Now, I have that in quotes because that's not a weakness, but that's how they saw it. The perceived weakness that Daniel had, the only one, was his faithful obedience to God, which begs the obvious question, is that mine? Is it yours? And if the answer is no, then that requires some self-inspection, right? Or we could be like Cyrus. What was Cyrus's weakness? He was worried about what everybody thought about him. What do my satraps think? What do my prefects think? What do my magistrates and my counselors all think? And based off my fear, I'm going to make decisions. So you have two roads for decisions: fear of others, fear of God. Daniel shows us one, the king shows us another, which then takes us to the third section. So Daniel's evaluated for his character. There are no chinks in his character, so they have to oppose him for his convictions. And as he's opposed, he remains faithful in his worship. We see that in verse 10. When Daniel knew the document, the law, had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. So Daniel finds out the law has been passed. Please understand that going in. Daniel knew what the law said. This is not a crime of ignorance. This is not the, I'm sorry, officer, I didn't know they had just installed a stop sign behind that tree. This is Austin saying, yes, I was doing 95. And what was the speed limit, sir? 30. That's right. We know the law. All right. Yeah. Going back to being critical of Austin today. So he knows the law. He goes up in his upper room. It would have looked something like this, although this is taken from a resort in Turks and Caicos. Right. You would have had a lattice because you didn't have glass. And so the windows open because it's hot in Persia. You cool off there during the day and in the evening. And this is where he goes. Scripture tells us he gets down on his knees 3 times a day and prays and give thanks to God as he had done previously. So what is Daniel doing? Where does this 3 times a day business come from? I think it comes from Psalm 55. David writes Psalm 55 and says, "But I call to God and the Lord will save me. Evening and morning and at noon I utter my complaint and moan, and he hears my voice. He redeems my soul in safety from the battle that I wage, for many are arrayed against me. God will give ear and humble them. He who is enthroned from of old, Selah, because they do not change and do not fear God." David apparently 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night, took a knee before God and prayed. And I tend to think he must have been fairly faithful about it because he's writing about it here. Now, that I think tells us why Daniel's doing it. I think he's modeling David. I really do think that. Now, why is he, according to the verse, looking towards Jerusalem? I think he's doing what Solomon said. Solomon said when he consecrated the temple in 1 Kings 8, that if they, your people, repent with all of their hearts and all of their soul in the land of their enemies who carried them captive, where is Daniel? The land of his enemies, where his people were carried captive. And if they pray to you, God, toward their land, Jerusalem, which you gave to their fathers, the city you have chosen, and the house that I have built in your name, then hear in heaven, in your dwelling place, their prayer and their plea, and maintain their cause. Forgive your people who have sinned against you and all their transgressions that they have committed. I think for 70 years in Babylon and in Persia, Daniel was disciplined, and morning, noon, and night he fell to his face and he faced where Jerusalem, where God's house had been, and he prayed that God's people would be forgiven for idolatry and apostasy and just outright failure, and said, "God, forgive us and bring them back." And I think he'd been doing this the entire time. Now, if you want to think about something beautiful, think about this. He doesn't have much long left to pray, because imminently God is going to answer this prayer as he foretold through Jeremiah, through the pen of Cyrus, and send them back. But he'd been doing this every day, 3 times a day. So what then do we know from Daniel's decision? Number one, Daniel knew he was violating the law. I mean, you have to start with that. Now, how do we justify that? Because as we'll talk about in a minute, we're not allowed to just go violate laws willy-nilly, my speeding notwithstanding. So this is a little different, right? Because the law would require Daniel to pray through Cyrus. So in this sense, Daniel can't obey it because, as said by Peter in Acts chapter 5, we must obey God rather than men. So what is the principle? Well, Daniel knew he was violating the law, but he was justified in violating the law because to comply with the law would require him to violate God's law. That was a whole lot of law. So let me try that again. Can we violate human law? Yes, but only if complying with that law would violate God's law. If the law says that we may not meditate or read God's word, then we should absolutely find ourselves, in my humble opinion, justified to violate that law. Because God says, meditate on my word day and night. So in that sense, there is an irreconcilable conflict between the laws of man and the laws of God. Now, here is the rub. Most of the time, the conflict is not irreconcilable. So please hear me carefully. Chapter 6 of Daniel, I will actually broaden it. Daniel is not an excuse to run around willy-nilly violating civil order. The only time as Christians, and I'm going to qualify this in a second. The only time Christians, in my reading of Scripture, are allowed to violate civil law is when the alternative is to comply with a law that violates God's commands. That is it. Hard stop. You say, oh, but the founders of America 250, they violated the law. They opposed the king. Yes, they did. Was that not then rebellion? I think it was. They were fighting about taxation, which is not a biblical issue. Now, if King George had said, you're not allowed to practice your own religion in the colonies, then and he did say that on some level, that's different. But I think there's a fairly, what lawyers call a bright line rule, that we are to obey and honor and respect those in authority over us, including the ones that set the law, even if I don't like the law, if there's any way to do it without violating our Christian conscience. And how do we decide if we're violating Christian conscience? Is there any way to comply with the law and also comply with God's law? And I would argue we should try everything to do that. Now, you can't sometimes. And that means sometimes we have to oppose the law. But please don't take Daniel chapter 6 too far, is my moral of my diatribe there. So Daniel knew he's violating the law. What? Yeah. Yeah. That's why I think we can look at it and model. And look, I say that, look, in 2026 America, this is an important concept because the view of the large swaths of America is if you don't like a law, just don't listen. I would argue a Christian needs to be much more circumspect in deciding why is it that I am taking issue with this rule, this law, this regulation. Because if it doesn't conflict, I don't know that there's a scriptural predicate for just ignoring it. I mean, even Jesus didn't do that. So someone might say, well, yeah, but what if you're born in North Korea instead of the USA? Do you have to follow all those laws until they make you break God's law? I think you do. I think this is part of God's sovereignty. I am not an American because of anything I did. God put me here. And that's just how it is. So if you don't like it, take it up with God. I mean, I don't know. That's just my view. So take it or leave it. Number 2, Daniel knew God was eternal where the law was not. And this is important because God's laws exist from God. So they are imbued with God's sovereignty and God's eternality. They're also immutable. They don't change. So Daniel could look at the king's law and say, look, at the end of the day, I'm going to be standing before Yahweh and his law will remain. And Cyrus's law, to kind of paraphrase Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, even if not, God is God, right? So he understood the tapestry of the times. Number 3, Daniel understood consistency trumps circumstance. If we start making ourselves students of circumstance, then we're going to be battened around, like James says, with all of the winds that blow the waves. So we have to be grounded. How do we ground ourselves? Consistent faithfulness. Now, I do want to draw a brief contrast between Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's disobedience and Daniel's, because it gets to 2 sides of the same coin. So stop there for a second. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they refused to start participating in something they knew would be sinful. So the law was everybody bows to this golden statue. They say, we are not going to start doing something we know is wrong. I'm hard pressed to think of, I'm hard pressed at the moment to think of a parallel in American law. But the idea of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is we live consistent Christian lives. And if someone comes in and says, my rule forces you to do something against your beliefs, then we are justified in not doing it because that's an irreconcilable difference. For them, there was no way around it. Daniel's the inverse. Daniel refused to stop doing something he was told to do. See the difference? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were being ordered to start doing something. Daniel was being told, you have to stop. So whether it is a law or a commandment that says, as a Christian, you need to start worshiping another God, or I don't know, everyone has to start the day with a shot of tequila. I would say, yeah, hold on a minute. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to refuse to start participating in a sinful behavior. I'll give it, here's one. If my boss said from now on, happy hours 4 to 5 o'clock in the firm conference room, and if you refuse to come participate, you are fired. This would say that I need, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to say, no, I'm not going to start participating in a sinful behavior. I'm not going to do it. Fire me. That's your problem. That's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Well, what if my employer were to say, you can no longer read your Bible during work hours? And I say, but hold on, during lunch, I'm off duty. I don't care. It's my building. Then I think I would say, no, hold on. I'm not going to stop doing something that God says I should be doing. That's a poor analogy because I could do it in the morning. See, I could find ways around it, but you get the point. There's affirmative starting, there's negative stopping. Put this in the context of Christian ethics, and you get something I read in this book. It's called Choosing the Good by Dennis Hollinger. He said, Christian ethics is rooted in the very nature and actions of God and in our worldview as Christians. So when we're deciding what's right and wrong, we're having to look really at the nature of God and what that means for how we view the world. From these foundations sets forth the ideal actions and character to which God calls us. So we know what God is and who God is and what God values and commands. And from that, we decide what we do and do not do. Christian ethics, he writes then, is the moral ideal to which God calls us precisely because of a covenant relationship we have with him. Let me state it a little differently. Our ethics it's not about the consequence. It's about covenant with God. So we obey God no matter what the circumstances are, because we're not obeying like Pavlov's dog, because we're afraid of punishment. We're obeying because we are in a covenantal relationship with our Lord. And that's why Daniel could make the decisions that he did. That's why Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego could make the decisions they did, because they understood it's about the relationship I have with God as my sovereign, not the consequences. So that's the distinction there. Then these men came by agreement in verse 11 and found Daniel making,
Losing why that's important, because in either case, you're just obeying God.
Because I think that starting is an affirmative act. So if I'm gonna start a bad behavior, I think that's an easy one. I'm not going to do something wrong. But I think sometimes people have a tendency to view passive behaviors, I'm going to stop doing something, as less harmful. I'm going to stop. We look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and say, you go get them. Don't bow to that idol. But I'll bet you if you polled people, there would be some people that say, now, couldn't Daniel, maybe he could have closed the windows? Maybe, look, why couldn't Daniel just kind of prayer walk, right? Just under his breath. Why couldn't he hide it? What's the harm? Well, that would be saying it's okay to make passive changes that go against God's law. And so I think you have to cover both sides. We don't start doing things we're not supposed to do, but we don't stop things we should be doing, right? Both sides, just to kind of loop it up, is why I think that's there. So they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, The thing stands fast according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Right, this is all narrative. They go, these are a bunch of peeping Toms. They were clearly waiting, right? This goes back to they knew he would not compromise. So they just waited. And when they caught him, they ratted him out. And Cyrus, his hands are kind of tied. Verse 13. Then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you've signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. Now, I want you to note the attack, not just what they say, but what it means. First, they say, he's not like us. And before we're too quick to say, no one would ever make that argument. You and I both know it is very easy nowadays for people to say, oh, that you're a Christian. You're not like the rest of us. You're closed-minded, bigoted, prejudiced, because you don't, agree with the UMC's poster about love is love, right? So step one is always that, to demonize people. Number 2, they say, Daniel pays no attention to you, O king. What are they saying? He doesn't respect you. You, Cyrus the Great, Darius the Mede, he doesn't respect you. Even worse, he doesn't respect the laws and customs of the land. He doesn't understand things change. Society changes. We're growing, we're evolving. We're becoming self-actualized. And he refuses to accept that times are changing and that you've changed because he's not like us. So note strategically what they did. Number 1, they redefined Daniel's motives. Really, they inverted it. Daniel's real motive was Daniel had to obey God. They turn it into disobedience. They flipped it on its head. You don't think that they still do that? Look at the pro-choice, pro-life debate. We say all life is precious. We value life. And what is the flip that we've heard for 30 years? Well, but don't you value the life of the mother? Doesn't she have the right to choose the course of her own life? They use the language of our position against us. And by the way, we give as good as we get. We've done it with things all over the place, has evangelical Christianity. So this is the strategy. You invert and reframe the reasoning. Number 2, it becomes personal. To Daniel, it was about faithfulness. They flip it and they say, no, it's disloyalty to you, Cyrus. He sat in that room and he decided he wasn't going to listen to you. And by redefining and by personalizing, they make it seem absurd that you would do anything but obey the king, which I've done a lot more current events than I normally do. You likely remember this case, even if you don't remember what it was called. It was decided in 2017. It was Masterpiece Cake Shop. All right, this is a cake baker. Okay. In that case, the baker says, what? I just want to bake cakes. And I should get to decide who it is that I bake cakes for. And this is basically free market economics. So back off. And Colorado says, oh, no, you cannot. Because we're a free country, and that means freedom for the person that wants you to make their cake, even though they're free to go get it from someone else. And the Supreme Court decision that ultimately distills down, put aside what you think of the justices, but I think it was Justice Kennedy that even said this basically comes down to freedom of speech and freedom of expression and the rights of the state. That's it, right? Cake baker wins. So the strategy is the same. That is what Colorado did to the baker. They redefined it, and then they personalized it. You're a bigot. You are prejudiced. So the strategy stays the same, right? The strategy stays the same. Verse 14. We're not going to finish. Then the king, when he heard these words, I just realized what time it was. Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. And he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, know, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and the Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. Now, I think we overlook this if we're not careful. This says a lot about Cyrus. I think this speaks a ton to his character. So look at that portion of 14. There are two things that I think happen in this moment. Number one, I think Cyrus realized he'd been hoodwinked. I really think at that moment when they came in and said that about Daniel, I think Cyrus thought the following: he's not hurting anybody. That's not what I meant, but it's clearly what you all meant. And he realized he'd gotten taken for a sucker. And honestly, it probably made him a little mad. Number two, I think it reveals that he had a deep affection for Daniel, which goes to show you character comes like through, right? He liked Daniel. He trusted him. We know that because he was about to promote him yet again to be second in command of the kingdom. One commentator I read speculates, this is why I'm not adopting this, I'm just saying it's speculation. If Daniel was in fact the prime minister of Babylon and he traveled on behalf of Nebuchadnezzar for decades, it is not inconceivable that he was dispatched to the northeast and spent time with the Persians in the royal court. So perhaps Persia knew him before. Perhaps Cyrus had already known him. Remember, Cyrus was 62 at this time. Either way, Daniel's character brought him respect from another great man, Cyrus. And so you can see the distress. He sets his mind to deliver him. And it says he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Let me translate that. Every law has a loophole. All right. I can get you out of anything. With enough time and thought, you can get out of anything, but not this. That's what the king did. He spent all this time till the sun went down trying to find some precedent, some law, some custom, some scholar, something that he could do to unwind this whole thing, because he clearly knew it was wrong and it was unjust. But at the end of the day, the men come back. Note it says they came by agreement. So they're still, chitter-chattering with each other in the corners, and said, no, you got to do it. It is what it is. Now, I want to make 3 observations before we move on. Number 1, Daniel does not speak for himself. They accuse him. They arrest him. They charge him. He's in custody. He has to be in custody while the king's out there playing legal research. But we have no words from Daniel, not one. And who does he remind us of in that sense? Jesus, who is silent as a sheep to the shearers. So just because we are being wronged by the system does not mean we need to find the biggest platform with the loudest microphone or the social media platform with the most followers to air all of our thoughts. I dare say Daniel would not have jumped on X to share his thoughts on this policy. I think Daniel was doing one thing and one thing only. I think Daniel was praying. So take that for what you will. Number 2, Daniel does not protest the law. We do not have Daniel saying the following: this law is unfair. This is entrapment. This is wrong. I want a lawyer. Doesn't do it. He does not fight back. Number 3, he doesn't even engage. Now contrast that with Paul in the basement of the Sanhedrin, who starts mouthing off at the high priest. That was wrong. Now compare him to Jesus, who stands quietly. And we get kind of a model of, if there is a situation where as a Christian, I have no choice but to oppose the law, I do so knowingly. I do so with full knowledge and information that I am choosing the law of God over the law of man. And I therefore have to believe there was no other way. I think what Daniel says is, I don't then turn and make it all about me by pitching a fit, by trying to get all my people on my side. I just don't think that's what Daniel teaches. I think Daniel is busy right now saying, God, your will be done. That's what I think Daniel's saying. Now, can we avail ourselves of the justice system? Of course. But Daniel, to put it mildly, does not go raise a coup against Cyrus. He does not flee in the dead of night and go to Athens and get the Greeks all worked up and start World War Zero. Doesn't do any of that. He lets his good conduct and his graciousness speak for itself. So that's that. Verse 16, the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. the king declared to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve, continually deliver you. So you have kind of the climax of the story is what we would always think. I don't think it is. You've got the king calls Daniel and he casts him in. Now, the idea here, if you look down, this is Rubens. This is the most famous painting of Daniel in the lion's den. Anyone want to note the flaw? Yes. Here we have Daniel, a rather unsightly and unexperienced young man. So Rubens he really modeled him off David and Jesus in like medieval art is what he did. But the structure of the lion's den, that's actually fairly accurate. So this was written in 1778. And this was someone who did an excavation of other lions' dens. Daniel was not the only lion's den victim in the Persian Empire. They did it all the time. And he uncovered them, and he said they consist of a large square cavern under the earth, having a partition-like wall in the middle of it with a door, which the keeper can close and open from above. So you've got like a big old square with a wall with a chain or a rope that you can lift or you can lower. So if they need, right, the lions are just kind of prowling about, but when they need to clean it out or whatever, they'd raise the bar or the door, the wall. They'd throw, a fresh slave in. And when all of the it wouldn't be steak, right? They would just throw slaves in. All the lions would swarm and they drop the wall. And now they can safely scale down, clean it out or whatever else. So it's open from above like a cistern. And he wrote back in the 1700s, this description agrees perfectly with that which is here given in the text regarding the lion's den, right? So historically, we know that this was a preferred consequence. But go back to the verse for a second. So the king says, he brings in Daniel, he drops him in, and the king declares to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. This statement is the epicenter of the chapter. This is what it's building. It's not about Daniel. It's about Cyrus. May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. Now let's look at his theology before we call it a night. His theology is here. He says, you serve your God continually. Literally, you've always been, always are, and continue to serve your God. So he's emphasizing Daniel's faithfulness. Now, this is fantastic. It reinforces what we know about the consistency of who Daniel was. It does show that Cyrus is kind of a works-based thinker. His view is simply this. You've been faithful to your God. Maybe he'll be faithful to you. Kind of, you scratch God's back, God will scratch yours. That is the Cyrus view of theology. We, of course, know this is not accurate, but it is, I think, important to note that for Cyrus, there was no question Daniel was faithful. And when an unbeliever who's tossing you in a lion's den is saying, you're a faithful follower, that's why I'm doing this, I guess that's the highest compliment you can get. Now, look at the bookends. May your God deliver you. It reads like almost may you have many happy birthdays after today. And that's not really a great translation. Essentially, what Cyrus is saying is, I hope maybe, I'm not sure your God can. And if he can, I'm not sure he will, but he should because you've been really faithful. So he's conceding, as Cyrus, Daniel's faithfulness. He's questioning God's power and will. So this is why we can safely say Cyrus is not like a faithful follower of Yahweh at this point. He's a fan of Daniel, but he does not understand God. Verse 17 and 18. One more and then we'll stop. And a stone was brought, or not. A stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions. You can decide in your own imagination what diversions the king of the world's biggest empire would have had. Think about Disney's Aladdin and all the dancers, and you get an idea of what he forswore this night. And sleep fled from him. So he rolls it, he seals it, and then he goes back. He's not praying, mind you. He's anxious. He's nervous. This is his friend. And this is wrong. I really believe that. I think Darius knows this is wrong, but he can't stop it. Now, let's put the timeline together briefly. So in the morning, you have the law signed. I think that when you put the text together, this is what you get. The morning of this day, I think this is all like an episode of 24, the day in the life of Daniel Bauer. Okay. The morning, the law is signed. What's Daniel do? He's praying. While the law is signed, he's praying. Then Daniel hears the law was signed and he goes about his business until noon. At noon, those peeping Toms are out there creeping in the trees. And what is Daniel doing? Daniel prays. They catch him, and Cyrus spends the rest of that day trying to find a way to change the law, which takes us to the evening. And in the evening, Cyrus seals that container, and Daniel is silent the whole time. Now, what do we think Daniel was doing in that lion's den? Praying. Now, I'm going to tell you, I have 12 slides left. You tell me. I think we should just keep going. 10 more minutes. Can you give me 10 minutes? All right. See, I knew someone. Now, what does Cyrus do? Daniel, he's praying. Cyrus is anxious. In Daniel, though, we see that we rest in deliverance. When our character and our convictions and our worship are sound, I would argue, come what may, we have nothing to fear. Okay. Verse 19 and 20. Then at the break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. As he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Now, this is the pivot. This is the focus. This is the center of the chiasm. So note what he says. You are a servant of the living God. He does not question God's existence. Number two, whom you serve continually. He doesn't question Daniel. So what then is the question? He cries out in a tone of anguish. Well, why is he anguished? Why is he, in a very unkingly way, running to the lion's den at the break of dawn? Because he was not sure God could or would save him. This tells us a great deal about Cyrus's worldview. It tells us he's henotheist, the same way Nebuchadnezzar was. It wasn't a question of if Yahweh is a God. It was a question of if the God would come through. Or would it be like Baal on Mount Carmel that was busy going to the bathroom or taking a nap? All right. So the key question in the whole chapter is, what will Cyrus do with what happened? Recognizing how close he is to really understand it. Verse 21. Then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. Long live the king," from the bottom of the lion's den. "My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king. I have done no harm." Now, this is the same exact word that we saw in chapter 3, I'm sorry, with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There's a fourth man in the fire, one like the Son of God's, right? It's either a theophany, a pre-incarnate Christ, or an angel. You say, which one? I say, I don't know. But it's one of the two. I would say it probably doesn't matter, because for Daniel, it was enough. Now, for my vote, I think it's a theophany, because I think that's what was happening in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's case. Same word, same type of situation. And Daniel's awfully calm. And Daniel knows how to call angels angels. He's going to do it later when he meets one. So whichever it is, the angel came, shut the lion's mouth. This reinforces what we learn in Hebrews, where it says that God closed the mouth of lions. That's the other reason I think it was a theophany. It doesn't say God sent angels to do it. It says God did it. So, and they have not harmed me because I was found blameless. Now, let's just stop the train there. Daniel is not saying, I earned it. What he's saying is what Peter said later in what we talked about earlier today. I was submissive to God's will. He chose to free me from this. And so that's how it is. It is, Daniel is not taking credit. Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. And the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. A grisly fate. And we read it and we think two things. Number one, awfully harsh. And number two, why is it there? Why is it there? Let's deal with the first. Persian law, as it's been translated, says the following: on account of the guilt of one, all his kindred must punish. So Cyrus is just following the law that they wanted. They tried to play legal games. Cyrus just does it right back, right? So I think that's why he does it the way he does. The question of why it's here, I think, is Scripture's way of verifying Scripture. So they get, some commentaries say it would have been 20 to 50 people tossed in this lion's den. Now, they're all eaten. And it says before they even got to the bottom. So it's like the lions jump in the air and start snatching them. Why does that matter? Well, here is why. Because the critical explanations for Daniel and the lion surviving the lion's den are as follows. Number one, the lions weren't hungry. Like Daniel went down, they'd already eaten a big meal. And so Daniel went to his corner and the lions all went to theirs, and they all just spent a peaceful night together. Well, here's the problem. They ate families. A bunch of them. Clearly, they were a little hungry. Okay. Here's argument number two. Maybe these were tame lions. Like in Wicked, right? The Wizard of Oz. And these lions, maybe these were, Cyrus pulled a fast one and he threw him in his like zoo as opposed to his torture chamber. Okay. What's the problem? They ate families. Okay. Argument number three. This is my favorite. These lions are old. These lions had arthritis. I mean, their teeth are falling out. You know, they needed a nap. That's why all this happened. They're not hungry and they're tame because they're old and they're tired. But here's the problem. They ate families. So why does Scripture give us such detail? I think it is to refute and to address these arguments. Daniel was not eaten because he hid in a corner. Daniel was not eaten because a pre-incarnate Son of God appeared in that cistern and stayed the lions that he created and held together, according to Colossians chapter 1. And Daniel had a great night with his God. This is why the next morning he says, "Oh, King, how are you today?" Right? The detail is to support the fact that this is a real event. Remember, I told you Daniel's one of the most attacked books. And so I think that Scripture protects Scripture. Number 5. Deliverance then leads to proclaiming God's greatness. It was never about Daniel. Daniel was the vehicle of God's miracle. He was not the point. The point comes in 25 through 27. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in the earth, "Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion," so all of Persia, "people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and earth, and he has saved Daniel from the power of the lions." So you started with an edict that Cyrus had to be the mediator. And now Cyrus is really saying the same thing Nebuchadnezzar did. His God is the God. Now, I do not think Cyrus is converted here. I just don't know I'd go that far. We don't really have, I'm going to think about that. I can see both. The problem with Nebuchadnezzar the first time was he says, "Your God is God of gods and Lord of lords." Here, if you look at what Cyrus says, he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed. Cyrus does not put Yahweh on par and say he's just first among equals. So it's an open question whether this indicates, if it's heartfelt, then it might reflect that Cyrus was genuinely. The 30-day law? No, that law would have still been in effect. But Persia had double jeopardy, which means you can't be tried twice for the same crime. So, there's that. Now, I guess the issue that I would just kind of draw here is, what was the point of all of this? So all of chapter 6 shows that God's protection and Daniel's faithfulness serve their point. Now, fortunately, I did not plan on going through all these. I'm just giving you to them. If you go through all of these verses, you will find one common thread. They are scripture saying God acts to prove himself. Why did God deliver the Israelites out of Egypt? To show he was God. Why did God deliver the Canaanites into the hands of Joshua? To show that he was God. Why does God, in the person of Jesus Christ, come and redeem us as a propitiation for our sins? To prove that he is God. And so it's all about the consistency, but it's not just the consistency of Daniel. It's the consistency of God, right? Which takes us to 28. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius, and where it says it's better translated even the reign of Cyrus the Persian. I will give it to you this way. Daniel lived happily ever after. Daniel lived happily ever after. Now, what happened while Daniel was prospering and reigning and ruling? Cyrus sends Ezra back. And then Cyrus sends Nehemiah back. And then Cyrus gets letters from Nehemiah saying all the terrible things that people are doing. And Cyrus sends more letters and soldiers back. So Daniel presides over momentous events. But we come to the end of what we know of his life, and it is that he prospered during the reign of a foreign pagan king. Now, let me give you 13 things. These are on your page, and I promise I'm not going to get soapboxy about it. The whole point of Daniel 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is Daniel. He is the hinge that the whole thing turns on to point us to God. So what can we take away from Daniel's character to ours? Number one, Daniel lived a consistent life from start to finish. Now, look, we can't all be Daniels, and I can't go back and undo my mistakes. But I can choose this day who I'm going to serve. And wherever that moment was or is for you and for me, it just needs to be consistent from that point forward. Because look, if nothing else, you get to tell someone, if you're ever asked, you know what, before that day, I was this, but after Christ, I was that. And I was consistently that. So that's the challenge. Number two, Daniel never got bogged down in human fights. Now, I don't mean that Daniel didn't engage. Right? He was a politician and a diplomat. What I mean is Daniel didn't do petty stuff. Daniel wasn't busy fighting his foes in gossip and fighting stupid laws. Daniel saved his fights for the stuff that mattered. Number three, Daniel lived in the center of God's will for his life. I think you see that in his constant character and humility. He knew what God called him to do. He submitted to doing what God called him to do. And he always navigated right in the center of the current. And we all know what this feels like. If you don't, you are missing out. Do you know why I love teaching? Because there comes a time every time I'm up here teaching, I know I'm doing what God told me to do. And I don't even care if you all are here at that point. I truly don't. Because I know I'm doing what God told me to do. I always was envious of singers, because I'm told that with singers and musicians, there is a point where it just becomes them and the music. That's being in God's will. And Daniel lived it and was blessed by it. Now, I can't sing, so it's more like hell. But number four, Daniel had an excellent spirit and a right attitude. That means what he did, how he did it, and why he did it was always unto excellence with the right attitude. It's not like my daughter when I say apologize and I get I'm sorry, Ethan, but you do smell. Like, no, apologize. I'm sorry, but Allie, none of that. It was always the right attitude. Number five, there is no evidence that Daniel ever got bitter when he was hated or insulted or mistreated. Now, this one I do not like, because my view for a long time was Mel Gibson's view in Lethal Weapon. If the world hates you, hate it back. But that is not the Christian way. That is not what Jesus said. That is not what Jesus modeled. And that's not what Daniel does. Daniel never, ever, ever shows a root of bitterness. He just goes about his business. Now, he may be in his head thinking God will deal with this when God deals with it, but he never acts bitter any more than like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego got out of that fire pit and decided they were going to get revenge, right? That none of that. Number 6, Daniel was without reproach professionally. As a politician, as a prime minister, as a scholar, there was no chink in the armor. But he was also without reproach personally. His relationships, his personal discipline, right? He was always above reproach. And this is a New Testament concept. Overseers in 1 Timothy 3, deacons in 1 Timothy 3 are said to be, they need to be above reproach. I don't think that's something restricted to the what is called the elders of the church in that verse, but I don't think that's limited to the pastorate. I think that's true for all Christians. What did Peter say? Be above reproach, so that when they come after you, your goodness will blow back on them. So that's Daniel. Number 8, Daniel made no distinction between the two. That's this concept. Daniel was who he was, wherever he was, no matter where he was. And that is hard. I struggle sometimes to be a Christian in the legal community. That's hard. And Daniel did it in like imperial politics. So there's no distinction. Number 9, Daniel was a faithful worker, even in conflict. Even when people were arraying about him to cause trouble, Daniel was faithful. It doesn't say that Daniel heard that Cyrus had signed the statute and he fled to his chamber and locked himself in. You know what he did? He went to work and he took his lunch break and he prayed. He came when the king called him in chapter 2 and chapter 4 and chapter 5, right? So Daniel was faithful even in conflict. Number 10, he was a faithful citizen even in conflict. Daniel was not, Daniel did not view his responsibility to be causing chaos in Persia. And he could have justified it all. He could have said, you know, Yahweh told me that this is how it's supposed to be. And he could have caused all sorts of trouble for Cyrus and Nebuchadnezzar, but he never did that. Why? Because he was a faithful worker, because he was without reproach. So he was a faithful citizen. Now, there's an exception because he was not a faithful citizen when they told him he could not pray. But I would actually, no, that's not true. I think he was. He just made the choice. I'm going to disobey. And when the consequence came, he took it like a man. Without complaining, without whining, without all the things I've already soapboxed about. Number 11, Daniel put all circumstances he was in the framework of God's will. I think that's the only way we can explain his life. Every time Daniel did something, it was hung on the wood of what's God's will. What does God say? What does God value? Is this reinforcing God's holiness? Is this showcasing God to other people? Every action, every decision, every word for 80-something years was a painting hung on a wall of it's all about God. Every drop. And number 12, Daniel served faithfully no matter the cost. He was elevated by Nebuchadnezzar. Then when Nebuchadnezzar died, he appears to have been relegated to the basement or something. He was not part of the royal court, but he was okay with that because he was going to speak the truth. And when Belshazzar called him in and said, I'll give you all of the gold and the purple and the chains and all of these things, he said, what? You can't buy me. I'm going to say what God says, and that's what he said, right? He was faithful no matter what the cost. And then number 13, and I think we just shouldn't overlook this. Daniel strengthened the faith of everyone around him. It's easy to see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego because remember what happened in chapter 2. When the king said, tell me what my dream was and interpret it, Daniel said, give me a night. And what does he do? They gathered in a home together and they prayed. And then they got the answer and they thanked God. He strengthened the faith of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that night. And I believe he strengthened their faith when they stood in that fiery furnace too. But it wasn't just other believers. He strengthened Nebuchadnezzar's faith. If you buy that Nebuchadnezzar came to saving faith in Yahweh, there's only one explanation for that, and it is Daniel as the vehicle that evangelized and told him story after story of all the patriarchs, and in his life and in his choices stood tall. Then he did it again with Cyrus and strengthened the faith of the king who would send the exiles home. So Daniel's not just about Daniel. It's about, I think, like all people that have lived great Christian lives. It's the ripples that we leave outside of us. And I can't help but thinking about Harvey's funeral and how I left that funeral thinking to myself, man, if you can have everyone in your life saying what a godly person you were and what a godly legacy you left, you've lived. You've lived. Daniel lived. And when we get into 7 and whenever we get to the rest, we kind of see that it was even deeper and more obscure than what we knew at the time, because he didn't just live in the history. He was at the same time sharing